Good afternoon. Thank you for taking the time to attend this parallel event as part of the Commission on the Status of Women. This very important issue is being presented today by SPISI, the Society for the Psychological Study of Social Issues. I'm the main representative, David Levert, to the United Nations for SPISI, and I wanted to tell you just a little bit about SPISI and our co-sponsors before we start the event. SPISI was formed in 1936 and is composed of 3,000 psychologists and other social scientists who are interested in psychological aspects of social issues. Our goal is to apply the best scientific evidence for public policy and advocacy, and in turn to understand effective public policy and advocacy. So we are interested in both directions. Some of the issues that we have worked with over the years include poverty, peace and conflict, social exclusion, migration, stigma, extremism, climate change, sex roles, sexuality, and gender. SPISI's office is in Washington, D.C., and SPISI has maintained a team at the United Nations since the late 1980s. The SPISI team is accredited by both ECOSOC and DGC, or for those of you who remember, DPI. We should note that SPISI's, we've had a team since the 80s, but SPISI has been involved since the creation of the United Nations. Our flagship journal noted a visit to the UN headquarters, which was at that time in Lake Success, New York. And SPISI members have been working ever since the foundation of UNESCO and SPISI. I'd like to thank ahead of time the speakers for taking the time out of your day to attend, and also our co-sponsors. And our co-sponsors include the American Psychological Association, the Institute for Multicultural Education, and the Institute for Applied Advancement, the International Association for Applied Psychology, the International Council of Psychologists, the Psychological Coalition of Accredited NGOs at the United Nations, the European Health Psychology Society, and SPISI. Also, the SAFE Coalition for Human Rights. Thank you all for co-sponsoring this event. I also want to thank the SPISI United Nations team, the representatives, and particularly our interns in creating this wonderful event. And I would like to highlight the work of Lopez-Aybar, our moderator for today, who truly has been instrumental in pulling together this event. And thank you very much, Lauda. We are looking forward to it.
Thank you, David, for that introduction. I would like to start by welcoming everyone and introducing myself. So my name is Laura Lopez-Aybar. I am a proudly born and raised Puerto Rican woman. I am a doctoral candidate in clinical psychology at the Derner School of Psychology, and I am a member of the Society for the Psychological Study of Social Issues, UNGO team. We are very pleased to have you here today and to start this event. Today's panel is titled Eliminating the Intergenerational Transmission of Gender-Based Violence. And we're bringing together 5 speakers to address an important but often less discussed topic and challenge that society faces in eliminating gender-based violence. So the intergenerational transmission of gender-based violence is a process by which, when gender-based violence occurs in a household and it's not stopped, it will continue from generation to generation, creating a cycle and causing a series of worsening consequences for those involved and for society in general. Today's topic is personally meaningful to me. Intergenerational transmission of violence has affected me as the granddaughter of a survivor, the daughter of a survivor, and as a survivor myself. I have witnessed firsthand how gender-based violence can cyclically travel from generation to generation. The men and boys in my family grew up with messages claiming they are superior to women, and the women and girls in my family grew up with teachings to be submissive to men. As a girl, I would hear my community members say, if a boy is hitting you, it is because he likes you. Or girls should stay quiet because if you speak up, people will not like you. Me and my friends learned to have eyes in our backs so we can always be alert when we're outside. We're fearful for our lives because if we're raped, beaten, or worse, killed, it will somehow be our fault. It will be because it was late or because of what we were wearing, or just because we needed to be disciplined by someone. As a society, we all live in this culture, a culture that is violent towards women and girls. Um, from these experiences, I learned how difficult and challenging seeking help and healing can be, especially when the systems and agencies that are supposed to be in place to help you can sometimes cause more harms. Our panelists today will share the implications of this intergenerational transmission of gender-based violence on psychological, physical, and financial well-being, as well as proactive policy, advocacy, and research advancements to eliminate gender-based violence and guarantee equality for all women. Our first speaker for today is Dr. Uju Berry. She's the medical director of NYC Health and Hospitals Domestic and Gender-Based Violence Mental Health Collaboration. Her talk will focus on COVID-19 and rates of gender-based violence in the US, and in particular NYC. She will also be talking about gender-based violence and how it connects and travels in families and affects families in general. So Dr. Berry, take it away.
Great, thank you so much for that introduction, Laura. It was, I'm just very happy to be here, and I'm actually very thrilled to be on this panel with all the other amazing speakers. And you know, one of the benefits of going first is that I get it out of the way, and then I can sit back and listen to everybody else talk. So, but I hope I do a service for the panelists in talking about the work that we've been doing in New York City. So I'm going to share my screen. So as Laura mentioned, my talk today is going to be about caring for families affected by intimate partner violence. And a lot of my work tends to be around the domains of research, policy, and practice. I'm a child psychiatrist and a women's mental health psychiatrist by training, but have done a lot of work within policy throughout the course of my experiences at the federal level, at the city level, and at the state level. In addition, I also do practice research, mostly around integration and implementation science. And so this short presentation, which is packed, will kind of cover all of that, all of those topics. I don't have any financial disclosures. I do appreciate support from various institutions. Outline, I'm just going to briefly talk about IPV, just mostly to kind of help ground us, talk about COVID-19. I think COVID-19's we're coming up on the year, a little bit past the year anniversary of when everything shut down. I think it's very pithy for us to understand and talk about how much that had an impact on the work we do as clinicians, as researchers, as well as advocacies. Talk about the mental health aspects of IPB, and also talk about some research gaps and how this applies to the organization that I'm currently running. I usually like to start on my talks with a clinical case, again, to really think about the dynamics of what we're focusing on, really encouraging people to think about who we're seeing, who are those people that come into our office and that talk to us, can help us ground not only understanding what research needs to take place, what advocacy needs to take place, and what changes need to happen. So I'll read this out loud. Patricia is a 31-year-old single woman who grew up in an abusive home. She witnessed domestic violence at home between her mom and her biological father, and she herself was physically and verbally abused by her father before they divorced. She'd been depressed when she was a teenager and took an overdose of pills once, but never got any treatment. She's currently in her second trimester with her first child that was unplanned. During the COVID-19 pandemic, her partner, who has become increasingly verbally aggressive, put his hands around her neck for the first time last week. She's anxious, sad, unable to sleep, and unable to focus. She wants to do the right things for her baby, but is not sure she can cope. So when you hear this story, what are the things that come to mind? For me, a lot of things jump out at this story. Sorry. The fact that there's intergenerational violence, and part of the reason why we're here today is to talk about that. Her mom has been abused, and now she herself is also being abused too, as a child, but then also in her relationship, and this continuity of violence that tends to occur. ACEs, the adverse childhood exposures, the fact that she is experiencing abuse in the home, that there is neglect and there is violence, does put her at increased risk for developing trauma-related disorders. Untreated mental health. As we all know, mental health and the stigma of mental health makes it seem that people aren't able to get the help that they need, even though it's there for them. The fact that she's pregnant, which does put her in a higher risk for increased risk for intimate partner violence, but also increased risk for postpartum depression. COVID-19, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, how all of that is constellation of re-triggering events and also increased clinical concerns. There's an escalation of violence that's occurring during COVID-19, including what I put here at NFS, which is non-fatal strangulation. And non-fatal strangulation is actually one of the biggest risk factors for homicide. And when we think about intimate partner violence, up to 500% more likely to die by homicide if you've ever been strangled. The worsening of her mental health symptoms, which does make us think something needs to happen. But more importantly, Patricia is help seeking. She's going through this, but is asking for help and wants to be able to do the right things for not only for herself, but also for her child. So what is intimate partner violence? This is a CDC definition, which is, and they say it's a preventable public health problem, which means that we can prevent it as a public health institution. But it includes physical violence, sexual violence, stalking, and psychological aggression, including coercive tactics by current and former intimate partner. I underline coercive tactics because people don't necessarily think about that when they think about intimate partner violence. They think about it more as physical violence or psychological violence, but coercive tactics, which is what we're seeing even more so during COVID-19, the use of technology to kind of be able to really take advantage of that power and control dynamic. In terms of epidemiology, the reason why it's a public health epidemic is that 1 in 3 women in the world, as well as in the United States, have experienced rape, physical violence, and or stalking by an intimate partner in their lifetime. But 1 in 5 men have experienced the same too, but we call it gender-based violence mostly because intimate partner violence tends to affect women more predominantly in terms of the frequency, in terms of the severity, in terms of the risk of homicide as well. And then when you think about LGBT community, that also is something we need to consider too in terms of that gender and sexual dynamics. Within New York City, there in 2019, before COVID, there was about 112,000 domestic reported incident reports that were responded to NYPD, which came up to around 307 a day. And this is just in the city of New York. So when you think about it and extrapolate it to the rest of the world, it is pretty scary. And what we're seeing now with COVID-19 is that those numbers are increasing. If you open up a newspaper or a magazine or a blog, it's been terrifying to see that the rates of COVID-19 and intimate partner violence have increased drastically. And I like to refer this, and a lot of people are referring to this as a pandemic within a pandemic, that not only is COVID-19 a pandemic, but we're also seeing that the rates of intimate partner violence is also a pandemic. And underlying that, this pandemic has reinforced important truths. Inequities related to social determinants of health are magnified during a crisis, and shelter in place does not inflict equivalent hardship on all people. So again, we're also seeing that the pandemic is unearthing this gap in the services that are being provided to our clients. And why is that? In terms of the numbers, within the New York Police Department, we saw about a 10% increased rates of people called NYPD, but also IPB agencies have seen cases increase by 2 to 3 times, and calls to my agency has increased by 15%. And of those, 46% are new cases. So not only are we seeing more severity of the old cases, but new cases are coming in. And it really has to do with these pathways linking pandemics and violence against women and children. First and foremost is economic fragility. The insecurity that COVID-19 has caused within the population in terms of increased risk of unemployment and not knowing where the money is coming from. And economics, especially for women and children, is very, very vital if you want to be able to disrupt that power and control. If women want to be able to leave a situation or have those options, having access to be able to provide support for themselves is the key number one that research has shown, and is also what our clients and survivors have said as well. On top of that, the pandemic has also led to more quarantines and social isolation. So those sources of support to be able to reach out to are no longer there. There's family tension, and especially when you're thinking about living in New York City where there's 5 people to a 400 square foot room, there's nowhere else to go. And of course, family tension is going to rise, not only between intimate partners, but also with their kids who are staying home from school. And if somebody does want to leave, the programs and shelters may be full, or the services are limited, or there's a fear of being exposed to COVID if you were to go out and seek services. So there's really that cost benefit that has to be weighed out. On top of that, there's also reporting barriers. So although we're seeing these numbers rise, I actually estimate that there's probably higher, mostly due to the fact that in terms of for child abuse, for example, people who are mandated reporters, which are usually teachers or physicians, they're not seeing these kids because they're working from home for virtual school, or those opportunities to do well-check visits have decreased or have lessened. On top of that, the concerns about the NYPD and racial brutality has also affected people of color. And all that comes together when we think about the psychological consequences of COVID-19, mental health, trauma, and racial injustice. It becomes this perfect storm, where individuals with trauma histories face additional challenges and feel the impact of COVID-19 more intensely. There's a triggering and re-triggering of those past symptoms, those feelings of not being able to escape, those feelings of not knowing what's going to happen next. On top of that, being cut off from those close relationships that you were able to get some reprieve. Some of my clients have said, everyone's affected. Where else am I going to go? What else am I going to do? I can't escape. Compounded with that is the grief and loss of things that could have been expected, but also the death of loved ones. Added to that is anxiety. And then when you hear about this racial reawakening in the United States, there's that acute and historical trauma that includes intergenerational transmission of trauma that's really blending itself within the psychological distresses of our clients. And what we're seeing with our clients right now is that not only are we seeing new cases, as I mentioned, but the severity of our current caseload is also there. People who would be discharged from a program are coming back because of these sequelae. Intimate partner violence has a tremendous impact on psychological health. This is a pretty busy slide, but the real takeaway is that most people think about intimate partner violence and mental health, but think about PTSD. And rightfully so. About women who are exposed to intimate partner violence are about 5 times more likely to experience PTSD. But in general, it's actually the comorbidity is the rule rather than exception. And what I mean by comorbidity, I mean that it's usually people are diagnosed with at least 2 to 3 different DSM-5 diagnoses, not just one. So it's usually PTSD and a depressive disorder, PTSD and anxiety or substance use disorder. In terms of depression, women are more likely to be 4 times more likely to diagnosed with depressive disorders, including postpartum depression, at least 3 times more likely to be diagnosed with anxiety disorders, and about 5 times more likely to be diagnosed with substance use disorders. The impact of mental health and IPV is bidirectional, so that IPV increases the risk of mental health illness, which themselves also increase the vulnerability to intimate partner violence. And how does it affect children? As a child psychiatrist, I often think about this a lot. We alluded to, again, intergenerational transmission of trauma when we think about the genetic predisposition, the psychological predisposition, all that comes into play. And there's also the risk of becoming a perpetrator or victim, and the harm to children, both indirect and direct. And what I mean by that is that 1/3 of the children, in terms of direct effects, 1/3 of children who witness IPV are abused themselves. So again, thinking about the interplay of intimate partner violence and child abuse, it is really intertwined and oftentimes can't be separated. Indirectly, intimate partner violence influences caretakers' parenting style in terms of bonding and attachment. And this can be seen as early as the perinatal and postpartum period, which is a 1 year post-pregnancy. And IPV during the first year predicted infant regulatory difficulties. So the baby themselves weren't able to self-soothe at 12 months. And this was both reported by the mother as well as objectively reported by scientists. In terms of maternal mortality and suicide and homicide, this is becoming in the news much more, especially for people of color. And oftentimes people allude this to stress and racism and discrimination. But the other thing that is a silent killer is actually pregnancy-associated homicide and pregnancy-associated suicide, which actually outweigh the medical complications such as hemorrhage, eclampsia, preeclampsia, or amniotic fluid embolism. And when we did a deeper dive into these tables here, what we realized is that about 50% of the women who had died by suicide had a history of intimate partner violence. And about 75% of the people who had pregnancy-associated homicide also had a history of intimate partner violence. So something to consider when we're thinking about intergenerational transmission of trauma. It starts early, it starts in the womb. And so there needs to be a call to action. This is where the policy piece and advocacy piece comes into play. Call to action to really try and figure out how can we do a better job of integrating our services to better target mental health as well as domestic violence and intimate partner violence. And one of the organization I co-lead is the H&H's Family Justice Center Mental Health Collaboration, which is an initiative by Thrive NYC. The program is housed within the New York City Family Justice Centers, which is the largest network of family justice centers in the country. And family justice centers are the gold standard for delivering preventive and services for families affected by violence. It's a one-stop shop, which is always co-located by a legal system. And then now, for the first time in the country, we have high-quality, evidence-based mental health treatment by a psychiatrist and a psychologist in all the 5 boroughs in New York City. The FJC is catered to about 174 clients daily. And again, those numbers have risen because of COVID-19. Our program goals is to provide clinical care that meets clients in a culturally and trauma-sensitive way. We also do a lot of education to the staff, trying to reduce the stigma of mental health, as well as help increase the identity of intimate partner violence within the realms of psychiatry and psychology, both in academic and clinical world, and also do ongoing evaluation and research. Our services, we have a part-time psychiatrist, full-time therapist, a full-time administrator. All our services are free, and we are very, very proud of this, and we want to maintain this and make sure that we are not discriminating based on language, race, creed, gender, or financial stability. We do evaluations. Our model is more of acute crisis treatment, about 3 to 6 months, and then really kind of getting into longer-term care provided by group therapy, individual therapy, and psychopath management. Our core trainings are below, as you see, mental health 101, suicide protocol, grounding de-escalation, and vicarious trauma. One of our main goals is to create a referral network. We can't do this work alone. And so even though we work within the family justice centers, we're often trying to figure out new ways to work within the community. And on top of that, really kind of building up the services within the nation's largest public health hospital, which is Health and Hospitals, to be able to have better services to families affected by intimate partner violence. As I mentioned, 1 in 3 women and 1 in 5 men have a history of intimate partner violence. And so when you come into the hospital, you're going to see it. Even if you don't ask about it, you're going to see it. And we need to do a better job of not re-triggering and re-hurting our clients. And so making sure that adult mental health services, the child mental health services, substance use disorders, women's health, ER services, primary care, even neurology is well connected to be able to provide the capacity for our clients affected by IPV. Since the start of the program in 2017, we've seen about 350 clients a year. We've noticed in prelim research that we've noticed within 3 months, 80% report improvement in depressive symptoms, that 82% report improvement in anxiety symptoms, and 75% report improvement in PTSD symptoms. We do a great job of trying to partner with our non-medical allies in order to provide them with the expertise to kind of do the train the trainers around, how do you talk about ACS and family court with our clients? How do you help your clients write trauma narratives in order to get the U visas? And on top of that, we are also very, very adept in trying to provide training on vicarious trauma and really supporting the healers themselves. We made some changes during COVID-19 by switching to a completely telehealth model, so having frequent touch points. We noticed by doing so, we're having less no-shows. Our clients are able to meet us where they are, mostly because we do a client-centered scheduling. So we try and find times that our clients are able to meet with us and make sure that they're able to do so either by taking a walk or having some privacy. making sure that when we do ask questions that it's in a safe and appropriate way, asking yes/no questions, making sure we have code words if there's no privacy or if there's something that needs to be done for immediate help. I know that I'm running short of time, so I'm going to kind of speed through this so we can get to the other fabulous panelists. But I want to talk about this quote because, again, when we think about the work we're doing, we need to think about who are we serving? Who are these families? This is a quote from one of the focus groups that we ran. I'm now 7 months into being a single mother, and I'm starting to get comfortable in the role. My self-worth is often tied to my son and how I interact with him. The therapy has definitely helped. I'm different with him. I'm working on my feelings about being a mother. This helped me so much. I'm also getting better at identifying his feelings. But yes, he's doing so well. It feels so good that he's doing so well. He's thriving. I feel really good about that. And that's something we really want to be able to convey to our staff and to our clients and really kind of use this to help us think about addressing some of the WHO research gaps. The 3 areas we are trying to address have to do with healthcare policy and provision, making sure that there's a rigorous evaluation for any program that provides service delivery to investigate its applicability to other settings. We've done a little bit of that program evaluation, and I'll share a little bit about that. Really think about the psychological and mental health interventions, especially for those affected by trauma, and thinking that there may be a different mode of how to handle that. Research has shown that current models doesn't always work for families affected by trauma, that those, when we see improvements in scores, oftentimes there's a subcategory that doesn't improve in their depression or anxiety scores. And that subset tends to have higher rates of childhood abuse or childhood neglect, childhood maltreatment, as well as current rates of trauma. Think about the role of social supports, and then really think about the mother-child intervention, again, trying to reduce the intergenerational transmission of trauma. I'm not going to share so much about the results from our program evaluation just for time, but it's working. Our program is working, as I showed you earlier. We have some improvements in the scores in terms of depression, anxiety, and PTSD. But the other great thing is that we've noticed a drastic reduction in wait time. Before it took 6 months for somebody to see a psychiatrist, now only takes 2 weeks because they're right down the hallway. We've talked about vicarious trauma. We've talked about improvements in relationships with family members, and that we're really just trying to improve that network and referral. In terms of specific treatments, this is an area we're trying to figure out within our program. How do we address this research gap in terms of what are the specific treatments that are really targeted to families affected by trauma and violence? Again, knowing that previous interventions may not be applicable in this model. And so really trying to be creative and understand that a one size does not fit all. That some people may need a multitude of different treatments, such as prolonged exposure, combined with EMDR, combined with STARE, or seeking safety, really trying to figure that out. And ultimately, one of the ones that's really near and dear to my heart is really trying to figure out if we treat if intimate partner violence leads to mental health disorder in the parent and affects parental caregiving and ultimately affects childhood outcomes, can we reduce that and reverse that by treating the mom either through medication and psychotherapy? And preliminary data has shown that we are doing that. So hopefully I can come back and show you some more data around that. Our next steps is really just to continue where we're going, making sure to spread the word that our clients are not alone, really again, improving capacity, sustainable expansion, and really understanding the impact that COVID-19 has had on racial trauma in our clients' lives. I'm going to end there and turn it back to Laura.
Thank you so much, Dr. Berry. One of the research that we did in our lab was we look at things from a critical perspective of psychology. So we found that survivors of IPV and gender-based violence report discrimination from providers at high rates due to race and also because of their survivor status. So it really resonated with me what you said about having those networks and having those frameworks that are really compatible, but also having to train and create and raise and create anti-stigma campaigns for providers as well and include that in their trainings. So our next speaker is Dr. Natalie Woollett. She's a senior researcher and art therapist from South Africa. She will talk a little bit about the theories of intergenerational transmission of violence and how this affects women and girls. She will also be kind of touching on other like holistic approaches, such as creative arts therapist. Take it away.
Hi, I hope everyone can hear me. If not, Laura, maybe you'll let me know. My name is Natalie, and I'm also
I
delighted
can
to
hear
be
you.
Oh, great, thanks. I'm also delighted to be part of the panel and value the opportunity to share my work, but also learn from everybody else. Thank you for the invitation. I work in South Africa, so a lot of what I'm talking about has got sort of a little bit of a sub-Saharan African bent, but I think that it does pertain globally. So, okay, let me just see why I can't. Okay, here we go. So just a little bit of background. Exposure to violence has been consistently associated with detrimental outcomes across the life course. Individuals exposed to violence are at high risk for injury, infectious disease, and mental health problems in later years, as has already been raised by Dr. Berry. More specifically, exposure to child abuse and neglect and adverse childhood experiences is associated with an increased risk of mental ill health, sexually risky behavior, alcohol and drug use, interpersonal and self-directed violence, and injury due to intimate partner violence. However, a recent umbrella synthesis has also confirmed the observation that being exposed to violence is by no means equivalent to necessarily perpetrating violence in subsequent generations. So just something to hold in mind. Therefore, it appears that some individuals who are exposed to violence go on to perpetrate and others do not. And what are our opportunities there, particularly in terms of resilience? So I'm just going to share a couple of theories around intergenerational transmission of violence and why, how does this come to be? Bandura's social learning theory posits that behaviors are often learned from one's environment and that the family system plays a pivotal role in tutoring. Children inevitably mimic and learn interpersonal skills from their parents, and this theory explains why children who grow up witnessing and experiencing IPV are more likely to be either perpetrators or victims later in their own relationships. Attachment theory emphasizes that the initial relationship between infant and caregiver serves as the foundation for an infant's mental health and future attachments and relationships. For children growing up in violent households, expectations of security are often shattered as the protector becomes their attackers, and there's no one to turn for help, or there's not the promise of safety in that situation. If parents are not only the source of external danger, but are simultaneously absent in their duty to protect, those you love become those you fear, and that's your normal. This ability this leads to great distress and an inability to regulate overwhelming emotion often. John Bowlby states himself, hurt people, and that's how this continues. Other theories that are linked more to trauma, sort of theories of trauma, the mental health aspects of experiencing this violence shouldn't be underestimated, as already has been raised. Those who are consistently exposed to violence are likely to suffer from depression and PTSD, these comorbidities we talk about. And concepts of reenactment or repetition compulsion, as Freud liked to say, are implicated in the intergenerational transmission of trauma, the consequence of this violence. Trauma tends to be repeated on a behavioral, emotional, physiological, and neuroendocrinological levels, and many traumatized people expose themselves seemingly compulsively to situations reminiscent of the original trauma. Other theories, strain theories, suggest that persistent negative experiences that are unjust, high in magnitude, associated with low social control and model violence and crime lead young people to engage in violence and crime to cope. And social network theory suggests that transmission of violence through interpersonal networks occurs via exposure to violence and experiences of individual victimization and perpetration. So there are lots of theories on why this phenomenon comes to be. Largely also around notions of misplaced aggression or displaced aggression. You'll see in this slide, you know, this is a family, there's the father. He is anger and is directed this way, but maybe mom isn't able to meet him there and deal with this pro-socially, and she feels she doesn't have much power and control in that interaction and takes her anger for good reasons, but misplaces it and displaces it on where she feels more power and control. And this sort of emanates throughout the system with the little guy either whacking his sister or someone at school or, you know, the dog or the teddy in this case. But just to say that within this intergenerational transmission, victims are often perpetrators and perpetrators are often victims too. So it leads to a lot more complexity in trying to unravel or unbundle and indeed serve the needs of this particular family. We also see in highly patriarchal societies with very hegemonic masculinities, there's a gendered socialization that leads to power inequality, and then other kinds of inequalities. And we all corroborate in the social reproduction of that patriarchy when it goes unchallenged or unrecognized. And there are other models as well of just how complex all of this is, that this is sort of an ecological model that it's difficult with one solution to manage these problems because they play out on an individual, relational, community, social, cultural level. And so any of our interventions actually need to be quite complex in terms of managing this problem. So in my context, some of the best policies and best practice are things like positive and peaceful parenting practices, effective communication, especially around conflict and anger resolution, no longer accepting violence as the means of conflict resolution, and managing displaced aggression more pro-socially, or learning those skills of what to do when you get angry and how best to be able to communicate in that state. Addressing gender roles and stereotypes, but particularly issues of privilege and marginalization. Social norms change, and this is social norms change and recognize the value of all people, not just women, but children as well as men. Improved criminal justice system responses, improved health sector responses, addressing mental health concerns, but particularly trauma. I find in my own practice or what I've seen, the trauma aspects, I don't know if we all corroborate in the avoidance of trauma, but often people's trauma symptoms are the last to get treated. Their alcohol, their depression, all the other comorbidities get treated far quicker than PTSD does. Enhancing safety in schools and keeping girls in schools. This is particularly protective in low and middle income countries, although sometimes schools themselves are not safe places. Cash transfers, either conditional or not, but to help reduce poverty and the reliance of women and girls on men. And in my context, understanding the contextual links between violence and mental health, but also between HIV, and addressing head-on the stigma and mitigating its effects of both of these problems. So what needs to be done, in my view, often is taking a bit more of a systemic view of agency and power and control dynamics, enhancing agency in children in developmentally appropriate ways, also with adolescents, and then at the adult level, and then also within and between the systems that these individuals live and work within. The intergenerational transmission of violence is often combined with all sorts of other types of intergenerational transmission that are structural in nature, such as poverty, poor mental health, and inequality. Thus, policy needs to tackle the structural drivers of GBV and the intersectionality of violence with other major social determinants of health as well. And when this works well, it's normally when sectors that deal with intersecting issues merge their thinking, their funding, their resources to addressing the problems that they all share. So when the women's sector comes together with the children's sector, justice and health sectors work together, more powerful effects of change can occur. And just a word on resilience, because this is such a pathologizing sort of notion that, you know, I love Escher's artwork. He was really alert to showing how negative and positive things normally coexist, that the negative image is often shrouded or held by the positive and vice versa. And this is how I see resilience and mental health problems, that unless we're looking for it, we're not likely to see it, and it might not be shared from our patients. We have to ask them, how do they cope? What helps them cope? And try and strengthen their resilience and communities and cultural resilience as well. So resilience is just a balance between internal resources like self-esteem, agency, self-regulation, hope, perseverance, and external ones such as social support, safety, social connectedness. And there are many resiliency factors, but one of which I'd like to just speak about briefly is creativity and imagination. I'm a psychologist, but also an art therapist and a play therapist, so I have a bias towards these other ways of working. Unfortunately, they're not major randomized control trials that show the value of nonverbal forms of therapy, and particularly in trauma work. I found these to be incredibly valuable in my work. And why is it? We use our brain not to discover facts, but to hide them, and we're very good at that. And our language helps us protect all of those facts with lots of defenses. But art and play and creativity make the invisible visible, which is what's necessary in terms of narratives and all of this. And once that is out in the open, like Mr. Rogers says, if it's mentionable, it becomes more manageable. So in trauma treatment, it's not the verbal account of the trauma that is most important, but rather the non-verbal elements of that, the fragmented sensory and emotional elements of the traumatic experience that are hard to talk about unless you experience them in some way. And why creative arts therapies work, in my view, imagination often offers direct access to a client's world, where thoughts, beliefs, and feelings interrelate liberally with facts. Therapeutic communication is facilitated through the use of metaphors, symbols, or images, as opposed to the intricacies of spoken language. Words prefer a credible, however frequently incomplete, recreation of experience. Image making within a holding relationship and with appropriate materials can be powerful, as difficult feelings and traumatic memories are likely encoded in image and sensation and associated with nonverbal representations. So getting access to that nonverbal material is important in being able to manage the mental health effects of that trauma. These ways of working are also easily expedite safety and security in the therapeutic relationship. They're very valuable cross-culturally and with language barriers, because everybody knows how to engage this way. This is particularly relevant in my sorts of contexts that are very resource limited, and that these ways of working can be powerfully employed in group work as well. The use of the art product to discuss the traumatic event effectively reduces the threat intrinsic in sharing experiences of trauma by allowing for the constructive use of displacement by the production of these accounts. What you create is what you talk about with the joint gaze of your therapist. You are a team looking at this third element of the therapeutic relationship, and you you gain some distance from what that is. That helps you be able to integrate it. So we all are talking about language here. Eventually talking about the product is how we sort of get that bilateral communication between verbal and nonverbal areas of our brain. And we get some safety and distance from it as well. Making use of art materials and participating in the creative process effortlessly eases the release of energy through using your body and movement. When you're making or doing, you're constantly moving. And when you're moving, you're accessing different parts of your brain. This discharge of energy and tension may clear the way for therapy to begin with highly traumatized and defended patients. Art making and play have been found to assist clients to communicate the most unspeakable parts of their trauma stories, giving it structure, shape, and form, circumventing the natural tendency to avoid this kind of material. These approaches encourage clients to control the volume and content of information they provide, engage in manageable stress, while being afforded the opportunity to experience a sense of mastery over an event where there is usually a sense of complete loss of control. So this idea of mastering something quite physically is important. The use of art and play powerfully enables exposure to traumatic cues in a non-threatening way, permitting desensitization of anxiety, improving problem-solving abilities, and facilitating creative thinking, encouraging articulation of affective states and more elaborate and emotional narratives, which are helpful in securing U visas and all sorts of things. And also just a word around image making in the research process, as I'm a researcher too. Research that utilizes nonverbal methods such as drawings are also increasingly recognized as particularly ethical, as they offer research subjects active participation in the research process, authenticating their voice through their engagement, offering more developmentally appropriate means of accessing data, especially for children and adolescents or those with developmental problems, diminishing stress in the child-adolescent-adult interaction, and providing a more comfortable method of engagement than language. Nonverbal methods thus offer children, adolescents, and adults an easier platform of communication. They're powerful ways of working. And I'll just end with this quote by Plato. You can tell more about a person in an hour of play than in a year of conversation. And this is a truism in my own practice, so I share it with you. Yes, that's me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Woollett. I wanted to highlight two things that you mentioned that really were impactful and that I've observed in research also, is that trauma is often overlooked in favor of more pathologized ways of viewing individuals. And as trauma goes by ignored, you can see like how symptoms of psychological distress become more and more persistent. It also increases stigma and experiences of discrimination for survivors and individuals who are experiencing trauma. And another thing is the incredibly powerful tool of art and creative arts therapies as healing and powerful healing mechanisms and powerful tools of embodiment for individuals to express their pain and their suffering and what they're going through and their inner worlds in general. And we see that with the theater of the oppressed and guerrilla theater. We see how communities who have often been minoritized by society can have a venue of expressing themselves, offering very powerful tools. So thank you. Our next speaker is Lourdes Inoa Monegro. She's a program director at Salud in Puerto Rico. Her talk will be focused on the integrative work of Salud. They work with individuals and community at the national level and are involved in advocacy research and also activism. So take it away, Lourdes.
Thank you, Laura. I'll do my best to share my screen. Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here today. Let's see. I'm very grateful for this opportunity. And I also wanted to share with you that I will do my best managing my English, but sometimes maybe some Spanish and some Spanglish may come up. Well, as Laura said in her introduction, I'm also living in Puerto Rico out of this moment, and I just wanted to contextualize where we are at. And I'm speaking from a Dominican and Puerto Rican background. And as Salud, a Women in Health Program Director, we serve a population based in the East Coast of Puerto Rico, mostly the East Coast. Salud is a feminist grassroots organization. Was founded in 1979, focused on enhancing women's access to health care, especially sexual and reproductive rights, reducing violence in community settings, and fostering economic development opportunities available for women in Puerto Rico. Our mantra is that a people's health begins with the health of its women. We are profoundly committed to it, and we believe it as a truth that we want to share. As Laura also said, I wanted to focus this exchange with you in a more multi-level address on how we see the eradication of gender violence. So I would like to start with a social and political overview of Puerto Rico. In the past years, we have been surviving crisis after crisis, environmental crisis and political crisis, such as the pass of two major and catastrophic hurricanes to our area, earthquakes, and also just corruption and lack of governance is predominantly in our area. The mainstream narrative in the past 3 to 4 years has been that disasters are natural. And we want to challenge that narrative. We believe that disasters are a response for the political and power structures that are in place in a society. They're not only a natural event that causes them. We also have a lack of reliable data. Austerity policies that have been in place with a fiscal oversight board appointed by President Barack Obama to ensure the payment of Puerto Rico's debt since July 2016. The absence of citizen participation and citizenship exercise in the island, increased reprehensive legislation and the use of policy to control and criminalize demonstrations, public demonstrations. The lack of analysis of focus on people and women, at least from an intersectional approach, that is one of our approaches, and an exponential negative impact on Black, poor, immigrant, young, trans, and gender non-conforming groups. And this COVID-19 reality has hit us since the past year, the primacy of the biomedical approach relating to the COVID-19 public health response. So we want to challenge this scenario by addressing gender violence through a more comprehensive and holistic approach and a social justice stance. We believe that we create spaces and transformation for women grounded in connection and individual and collective healing are encouraged regarding violence and trauma. women are engaged in a space that fosters and dignifies a life free of violence, where violence does not define them. Violence is not the only thing they are about, and is that not the only thing that they want to heal or pursue, where their full potential is encouraged. And we believe radically that women are agents of change. We also work with cultural identity, right? The way the community accepts the eradication of violence against women. If it's a public matter that deserves a collective dialogue, that deserves change of beliefs and attitudes and concrete actions towards it. Acknowledgement of the intergenerational effects of gender violence. But this acknowledgement comes with an analysis of systematic oppression by the mainstream groups and internalized oppressions within our communities, how these power structures have an impact in the diverse population in the island. And we work a lot around this past 2 to 3 years to address institutionalized racism and colonial policies being pushed on us, let's say. Also by integrating a gender equity and a more decolonial framework to this issue, to address the austerity measures and this disaster narrative, and to also address the trauma-informed services that we provide. We believe that gender violence is not an individualistic, meet the survivor's needs, let's say, response. It demands an uprooting of its causes and disrupting the dominant discourses surrounding patriarchal and colonial values in our society. So we see it more as a continuum of response and an interdisciplinary approach. I would like to say that this is a multi-level feminist leadership response and intersection, right? In the sense of the direct attentions to survivors of violence, we are grounded in this trauma-informed and more of a culturally specific model in a social justice and emancipatory practice, and claiming the social determinants of health to be integrated in this issue and not fragmentize the way that we can provide the service. We try to be committed to the comprehensive and holistic health approach. We also think and practice that reclaiming art, joy, pleasures, and body autonomy is a fundamental part of our exercising our right to live free of violence and our right to exist as women. And doing this also by claiming the more Caribbean, Latin American approach in these services, using a methodology of popular education in all our groups and all our way of maintaining this continuous dialogues within the communities. A second level of this response, we try to frame our surrounding engagement and organizing. Right? The exercise is exercising public participation as an act of resistance, un acto de resistencia caribeña, and calling in non-gender violence related organizations and institutions to be part of this work and to be also accountable for what is happening in the country. And by doing that, we're building up a more diverse and ongoing movement, constantly mutating our strategies and our ways of addressing this issue. And third, and not least, claiming space, right? Claiming national response to survivors and to uplift women voices and ways of living in the island. In the sense of public policy and state of emergency, as a movement, we have articulated an island-wide response for addressing gender violence in Puerto Rico. It's a drastic response, but we have seen it as a necessary response and also temporary. We have claimed for a state of emergency regarding gender violence with 4 main targets. Addressing system failures, and as you can see, that includes allocating resources to guarantee the provisions of services to victims, the investigation, evaluation of the failures in the integrated response, and proper monitoring of agencies' efficiencies. Specialized training to health, justice, and criminal system personnel, and an assessment of the re-education programs for offenders. Second, we have a burden, as we say in Spanish, una deuda pendiente with women surrounding sexual assault survivors. So the issue of accountability is a top priority for us, and sexual assault survivors should be also a top priority. We have more than 2,000 safe kits that have not been processed since 2004. So this issue has been in the center of the demands on a state of emergency. Third, a public discourse towards gender violence, where service providers and social justice activists must have a guaranteed seat at the decision-making spaces. And this include all women, self-identified women, trans women. We want a gender perspective in all policy analysis and is a specific implementation in public education and curricular. I think this has been an opportunity for us to share an overview of what is happening in Puerto Rico right now regarding this issue. And I am more than grateful to be with you in the next hour to share other thoughts and just break down a little bit more on how we do it and why we do it this way and what are the results of this path that we have taken. Thank you all for your time.
Thank you so much, Lourdes. I'm always proud to walk and march alongside Taller Salud during protests and marches that are constantly taking place in the fight against gender violence in our island. Our next speaker will be Sonya Passi. She is a lawyer and the CEO and founder of FreeFrom, which is the nonprofit organization that is trying to fight financial injustice and create financial security for survivors of gender-based violence.
Hi, everyone. I'm not sure if I have to do something specific. Okay. Hi, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here. I'm so honored to have been invited, but also to follow the incredible speakers before me. My name is Sonya Passi. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I am the founder and CEO of FreeFrom, which is a US-based national organization working at the intersection of gender-based violence and economic insecurity. We have a specific expertise in intimate partner violence, though we understand that it is very hard to separate out the different forms of gender-based violence. For example, we know that 50% of sexual assaults occur within the context of a quote unquote relationship. But I will mostly be sharing statistics with you from the intimate partner violence lens. Also, I can only speak for the US. I know that we are talking globally, but I want to caveat what my limitations are in terms of my understanding. But it's been very exciting to hear about work in Puerto Rico and work in South Africa and to see all the links. Okay, so I'm just going to talk to you. I don't have slides, and that is just because I struggle to listen to folks and read their slides. So I'm going to try this way and hope that it works. So 1 in 4 women, 1 in 2 trans folks in the US will experience intimate partner violence in their lifetime. And the #1 obstacle to safety for survivors is financial insecurity. This is for 2 reasons. The first is it is incredibly expensive to experience intimate partner violence. The US Center for Disease Control estimates that intimate partner violence will cost a female survivor an average of $104,000. We also think that is an underestimate and does not take into account things like long-term therapies, both physical and mental, having to relocate, which means if you have kids, buying new clothes, buying new toys, et cetera, et cetera. In addition to just it being incredibly expensive to experience intimate partner violence, economic abuse occurs in 99% of all cases of intimate partner violence. And economic abuse can take many forms. It is essentially using money to control. It can look like not being allowed to work. It can look like being the sole breadwinner, but not ever having access to your own paycheck. It can look like having credit cards and debt in your name that you don't know about. I can think of one example of someone that we've worked with who 2 years after her divorce from her harm doer, her ex-husband, found out that she had $17,000 of credit card debt in her name that had never been paid off across 7 credit cards. This had meant that her credit score, which is incredibly important in the US as sort of your financial freedom, had gone down significantly, and she no longer had a credit score that would allow her to rent an apartment. It can look like not having access to your own bank accounts, or being given an allowance and having to account for every dollar that you spend. Another person that we worked with was financially controlled to such a degree that she went to her harm doer and said, I need money for tampons. And her harm doer said, well, by my calculation, it's not your period for another 6 days. So you're lying to me, and no, you can't have the money. And it can look like all of the above. And so, you know, in our society, we think of intimate partner violence as being the result of bad luck or bad choices or both. But really what we are talking about is a systemic economic problem. It has economic causes, it has economic consequences, and we are not adequately framing the problem. You know, I'm so excited to be on a panel where we're talking about intergenerational transmission of violence, because our society thinks of intimate partner violence as happening over days and weeks. But as survivors, we think about intimate partner violence as happening over years and generations. And there is a disconnect between the reality of the problem and our solutions. I can only speak for the US, but the way that we address intimate partner violence in our society is through temporary shelter and temporary restraining orders, or access to public assistance. And it's very much sort of misogyny upon misogyny upon misogyny, that our society basically says, here's a little bit of help, but then you're on your own. And so really takes the view, I think, of you got yourself into this mess and you'll need to get yourself out of it. And so the work that we do here at FreeFrom is really kind of thinking twofold. The first is we're dealing with a systemic problem, which means it is a problem created by our society and perpetuated by our society. The burden of safety, the burden of recovery, the burden of healing should not fall on survivors ourselves. And our entire society has to take accountability for the problem. The way that we're addressing the problem with shelters and emergency relief is akin to if that's how we dealt with racism. Racism is a systemic problem. It's in the very fabric of our society. So is gender-based violence. And really making sure that there is an ecosystem of support around survivors so that they are not bearing the burden alone. And then the second kind of framework that we're trying to expand is right now in the US, you really do not have access to support as a survivor until you leave. And that is, of course, very problematic for a number of reasons. Number one, leaving is expensive and not everyone can afford to leave. Number two, not everybody wants to leave. Whether that is because they have determined that it is not safe for them to, or because doing so would mean that they had to give up their family, their children, their community, or because they actually just want to figure out how to make the situation that they're in work. And as harm-free as possible. And then on top of that, of course, the problem with only delivering services once somebody leaves is it puts the burden on the survivor again. And it means that support is not provided until a moment of acute crisis. And at a moment of acute crisis, the financial impact of intimate partner violence has been so compounded that it may actually be at this point impossible to recover from. You may have too much debt. You may have been out of the workplace for too long to be able to easily get a job. You may have experienced so much financial trauma that it will take years and years to recover from. And so in addition to building this ecosystem of support around survivors, expanding the continuum of support for survivors so that support is provided long before a moment of acute crisis so we can avoid the worst financial devastation of harm, and that support is provided long after. We're talking about a generational problem. We need to have solutions that take that into account. I wanted to share it with y'all at the beginning of COVID. We started to get cash assistance to survivors in the US. Survivors in the US were saying that their number one need during the pandemic was cash to spend as they need. And we were able to actually collect data from almost 4,100 survivors about their experience, the economic experience of the harm that they have been through. And so I mentioned earlier the cost, $104,000 is what the CDC estimates the cost of harm to be. But we were able to get much granular in the data collection that we did. So on average, survivors report that they have $1,300 stolen from them by their harm doer each month, and have an additional $1,100 of their own money restricted. So it's their money, but they're not able to spend it how they need to or want to. In addition to that, harm doers incur an average of $16,000 in coerced or fraudulent debt in a survivor's name each year. Survivors report that they lose out on an average of $23,000 of income each year, and that they incur almost $18,000 in property damage each year. And so very quickly you start to see how these costs add up. And and how expensive it is to be in a situation experiencing intimate partner violence. The other thing that I wanted to share was we are not talking about intimate partner violence as a siloed issue. I mean, our society really is addressing it as a siloed issue. But as I've already sort of talked about, it's an economic issue, but it's also a gender issue, a sexuality issue, a race and ethnicity issue. And when you think about this as an economic issue and the way that it intersects, you also have to think about what are the other systems of oppression that are impacting survivors' economic security. So in the US, for every dollar that a white man earns, Black women earn only 62 cents on the dollar. Indigenous women earn only 57 cents on the dollar. Latinx women earn only 54 cents on the dollar. And that's earning. And then let's talk about owning. For every dollar that a white man owns, Black and Latinx women own only pennies. Indigenous women own less than a tenth of the median wealth of all Americans. And trans folks in the US are 3 times as likely than the general US population to have an annual household income of less than $10,000. So now within that context, within the context of earning so much less, within the context of owning so much less, now you add $104,000 in costs, and you add the impact of not being allowed to work and having debt in your name that is not yours. And you very quickly again realize just how difficult it is to recover and to find safety when you have these multiple systems of oppression working against you. Just to really quickly talk about what we are doing to address this. We are doing capacity building for the movement here in the US. So for shelters, YWCAs, other domestic violence and intimate partner violence organizations, capacity building so that they are able to support their clients in building income, in repairing their credit, in recovering from the financial harm that they've experienced. In addition to that, we're building networks of survivors across the US working together outside of a hierarchical model, just in a peer setting to support each other in building financial security. At any point, we have many people in these groups that have not left, that may never leave, but they're building financial safety for themselves in community with other survivors. And then I talked earlier about holding other pillars of our society accountable. So we estimate that 50% of survivors do not have safe access to a bank account. We are working with banks to put in place policies and procedures to make banking safe and accessible for survivors. We are working with employers to implement paid and protected leave for survivors so that they do not lose their job. Credit card companies to make coerced and fraudulent credit card debt harder to accumulate in the first place and easier to recover from as needed. And then really thinking at a local, state, and federal level about what policies are having a positive or negative financial impact on survivors, and how can we create kind of just a collective knowledge of this is a financial issue. And so anytime you are thinking financially, whether it's about health insurance or it's about tax reform, you need to be thinking about what the cost or impact of this will be to survivors. I am at time, but just super excited to have begun this conversation about that economic impact, and excited to see if there's any questions or any ways in which I can work with anyone who's interested. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sonya. This issue is often overlooked, and it's so impactful as I have seen it in my clinical training, and how survivors of trauma in general have, like, the economic disparities are very visible, very tangible. And I'm really happy to have you here and give us this information, just because it's often that survivors have the consequences are incredible. Like, I've seen survivors who were executives and their perpetrators stole their credit cards so they could no longer pass a background check to get housing. They could no longer pass a background check to go and get another job. So it is really, really important work. So thank you for that. Now we will have Annette Lyth. She's the Chief of Office for Dr. Majid, who couldn't join us today. Dr. Majid is the Special Representative under Secretary General of the United Nations for Violence Against Children. So thank you, Annette, for being here and for speaking for Dr. Majid and her office.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the organizers to invite us to this panel, and thank you very much to my fellow panelists for those very interesting presentations. And what's really striking is how global this problem is and how the issues that victims face are very similar on a global level. The Special Representative, Dr. Majid, is of course very sad that she wasn't able to join this panel herself, as this is really an area that is at the core of our mandate. Our mandate is to act as a global advocate on all forms of violence against children in all settings. And both violence against children and violence against women are among the most frequent and widespread violations of human rights across the globe, and occur, as we just heard, in all societies and cultures. It's also a major obstacle for achieving the Sustainable Development Goals and the Agenda 2030. Here we of course talk mainly about SDG 5 on gender inequality and SDG 16.2, which is violence against children. But because the SDGs, this is the Sustainable Development Goals on the UN agenda, are so interlinked, it's impossible to fulfill or achieve one of them if not all of them are achieved. And it's very clear how, from the conversations we just heard, how violence against women and violence against children impact not only the family or the individual, but also development of the society at large. So millions of children around the globe are exposed to domestic violence or intimate partner violence from early childhood, with a serious negative impact on their physical and mental well-being and development. According to the Global Status Report on Preventing Violence Against Children that we published last year together with WHO, UNICEF, UNESCO, and the Global Partnership to End Violence Against Children, nearly 3 in 4 children, or 300 million children aged between 2 and 4 years, regularly suffers physical punishment and or psychological violence at the hands of parents and or caregivers. Approximately 1 in 4 children aged under 5 years, that's around 176 million children, live with a mother who is a victim of intimate partner violence. Irrespective of whether children directly experience violence or not, living in a household where the mother is regularly subjected to violence can be one of the most painful experiences children can live through, and clearly a form of psychological abuse. Hence, there's a growing recognition that children who witness violence should be acknowledged as victims in their own right. Violence against women is deeply rooted in gender discrimination and the low status of women and children in the society, and is often fueled by gender stereotypes and patriarchal social norms that normalize and accept violence. Violence against women and violence against children often co-occur in the same families. Men's use of violence and controlling behavior towards an intimate partner often extend to physically punishing their children as a means of discipline. Moreover, women who experience violence at the hands of a partner are more likely to use physical punishment themselves to discipline their children, as we just heard from one of our previous speakers who showed that very pertinent character. The impact of experience or witnessing violence as a child has wide-ranging and long-lasting effects. When a child experiences violence at home, they learn to tolerate violence. They are more likely to lack empathy towards others and more likely to perpetrate violence themselves. Evidence shows that children exposed to domestic violence are more likely to act aggressively towards their peers or siblings and to carry violence into their adult lives, either as victims or perpetrators. It's this aspect of exposure to violence that drives its intergenerational transmission. This has direct impact on their relationships with intimate partners, as well as their ability to be emotionally responsive parents. The Global Status Report that I already quoted from estimates that adults who were physically and sexually abused as children are 14 times more likely to perpetrate physical and sexual intimate partner violence, while girls are 16 times more likely to suffer physical and sexual intimate partner violence in their adult life. Prevention of violence in childhood is therefore indispensable for long-term prevention of violence of women and vice versa. And this points at the need for a more coordinated effect that effectively tackles violence both against children and women. Of course, as we already heard, the COVID-19 pandemic has made the situation even worse. Confinement measures, the additional stress placed on families, and the disruption to already limited child protection services has exacerbated the vulnerability of children to various forms of violence. This includes violence and abuse within the circle of trust, including caregivers and other relatives, gender-based violence and sexual exploitation, both online and offline. The situation is aggravated by children's lack of access to school friends, teachers, social workers, and safe spaces. Moreover, the socioeconomic impact of the pandemic exacerbated gender inequalities, poverty, and vulnerability to many forms of violence, including intimate partner violence, forced and early marriages, teenage pregnancies, sexual exploitation, and abuse online. As we already heard, there's no one response that will tackle this problem alone. Instead, we need to work on several parallel tracks simultaneously. We need to engage a wide range of stakeholders. This is not only the responsibility of women and girls, even though sometimes you can get that impression when you hear discussions. We need to engage with both women and men, mothers and fathers, boys and girls. We need to involve community leaders, faith-based organizations, teachers, journalists, and other groups. We need to provide parents with tools for positive discipline so that they do not need to resort to violence. We need to challenge social norms about gender relations and the use of violence through education, media, promotion of positive role models, and other forms of communication for behavioral change. In particular, we need to engage fathers so that they fully comprehend the important role that they can have as a positive role model, both for their own children, but also for other fathers. Engaging men as involved fathers can lead to improved maternal and child health, stronger and more equitable partner relations, a reduction in violence against women and children, and lifelong benefits for daughter and sons. Research has shown that men's involvement as caregivers also have benefits for them. It makes them better fathers, improve their intimate relationships, and enhances their own quality of life. Unfortunately, in many societies, there are still low cultural expectations of men as parents, which means that we often leave out a key individual who impacts the family, the father or father figure. We must also ensure that there's an effective response for those children who are victims of violence, which must include that child protection agencies work together with specialized support services for victims of gender-based violence, such as shelters and hotlines, along with social welfare, health and mental health, education and justice, as part of a multi-sectoral and rights-based response. And most importantly, we need programs that involve children and empowers them, both girls and boys, to become positive agents of change. In our work, we promote girls' empowerment as the most powerful strategy to tackle gender discrimination and gender-based violence. We just issued a report on children as positive agents of change, which includes several examples of girl child-led initiatives and actions to challenge pervasive gender norms and inequalities and to end gender-based violence, including child marriage and female genital mutilation. You can find this report and other related ones, for example, one that we issued last year on the impact of violence on children's mental health. It's called Hidden Scars. You find all of this on our website. And with that, I'm looking forward to continue the discussion during the next Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Annette. You touched on a lot of like the policies that need to be worked on. And to start off the panel, I wanted to ask what policies are interfering, what are the major barriers in getting these policies in place? This is a question for everyone in all of the panelists.
Laura, can you repeat the question? Is it for all policies? What is the obstacles?
Yeah, what are the major barriers that you all see in getting these policies that you mentioned during your talks in place? So getting economic security for survivors, achieving a holistic practice and establishing cultural frameworks and trauma training.
I can talk a little bit from my perspective. We're really pushing for policies that take into account the economic impact of intimate partner violence, but our governments don't think of this as an economic issue yet. And so very often I will talk to even policymakers and advocates about some of the priorities we have around paid leave, around safe banking, and they will say, we've never thought about that in the context of intimate partner violence. And so part of the bigger work to do is the culture change and the social education. And then to kind of force policymakers to not just give us breadcrumbs. You know, the advocates in the US fought so hard for the Violence Against Women Act. And basically there is one single piece of legislation in the US that considers survivors, which is not enough because this is a systemic issue. And so just like veterans and elders are considered in every piece of legislation that we do, survivors need to be as well. And so it's just a lot of pressure that needs to be put on lawmakers and a lot of education that needs to be done more generally at a social level.
Thank you, Sonya. I think Dr. Woollett raised her hand earlier.
Sure, I think Sonya nailed it, but I think what we see in our context and in many sub-Saharan African contexts, the law is not the problem. Oftentimes the law is pretty well written, pretty clear. It's the implementation of the law that's problematic, and the people who implement the law are the humans that are supposed to be doing their jobs. And I think that speaks to Annette's point about getting people in positions of power within communities to really understand the issue and to buy into it, because they're the ones who are probably going to be implementing the pieces of it that go towards social change and towards holding those accountable in their communities to the laws that are being broken or not implemented well. And I think the other piece for me is just helping people in general understand how all of this is so systemic, because I think many laws or policies are made for one particular thing, and those go to people who are managing that thing. But all of those people sort of, I think if we come together as lawmakers, policymakers, implementers, and see that we're all sort of you know, that there's that whole quote about there's an elephant in the room, everyone's got the blindfold on, and it's like, well, I've got the trunk, the one person with the blindfold, oh, I've got the tail, but we're actually all hitting the same thing, but from different places, and many times we're not aware that we're doing that. So I think more conversations with people around how our work helps their work and how their work helps our work, so that we can all be managing the problem, is probably also a wise bet.
And Dr. Berry highlighted that multidisciplinary collaboration that I think that's what you're referencing in the referral network that she mentioned during her presentation. But you also bring to light that whole model that was really helpful in seeing it, where we're individual, this is more of a societal problem, which is also what Sonya is bringing up. Where it's extremely complex, it requires multidisciplinary effort. Does anyone else want to have a chance to answer the question about major barriers?
I would like to say yes. Does everyone hear me?
Yes.
Yes, I also wanted to say that regarding intergenerational trauma, there's a pretty psychological or individualistic point of view. And just adding to the words of Natalie and Sonya, that we need to a bigger table, let's say, to do this analysis and just to put our best efforts forward in a more interdisciplinary approach to these problems and to this systems barrier. And that comes from everyone that is doing this work, everyone that is trying to eradicate violence against women, seeing it in a multi-level way of working, not only responding to survivor needs. I think that's a message that we want to put out there. It's not a single person issue, or it's a healing people issue only. Healing is a political act, and that is at least that's where we come from, because what we need to heal has not been it has been our burden to carry, and it has been a societal burden to carry. I just wanted to say that.
Yeah, I'll also add to that, my panelists are experts in this and have talked so eloquently around this issue. And, one of the things they'll add to it is this notion of, who's responsible. And I think for a long time, if you look at the history of how advocacy and gender-based violence has taken hold, it's always been like a small grassroots organization, and people have just kind of left it to that. And I think if you really want to make impact, because this is a systemic issue, the system and the society needs to take ownership. And until they do so, they're going to just be putting these Band-Aids and doing piecemeal work to kind of cover it up, or actually delegate to somebody else, or put money in this little pocket. But that's not enough for something that is a very global epidemic and systemic issue. We need to take ownership of it as a society. And we haven't done that yet. And because we haven't done that yet, the policies are coming out are very piecemeal. And so we need to think of it more from a blanket thing, that this is something that not only affects women, but affects society in particularly. And on top of that, going back to Sonya's point, when you think about affecting the children, you're affecting the economic mobility of future generation. So, and so people need to really take that into consideration when they're trying to think about solutions, that it's really, it's a much more global aspect that needs to be thought of that way, and people need to take responsibility for that.
Laura, can I jump in?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I really enjoy this panel just because it is such a holistic panel where we look at this problem from so many different angles. And I think previously there's been a tendency to look at this in piecemeal. Also from the activist side, I have to say that we have women's activists pushing women's issues, and then there are child rights activists pushing child rights. And this has somehow translated also into how we provide services, where we have the child protection system, and then we have the women's protection service providers. And I think it's just recently that we're really making a consolidated effort to try to bring all these issues together, because we see that they are all interrelated. And I can say, for example, so I'm Swedish originally, and only recently was the child recognized as a victim when he or she witnessed the mother getting beaten up by the father. So that's I think it's a very significant step towards seeing how all these pieces come together. Yeah, so I think this is really important. And also, all my credit to Sonya. I have to say, I don't think we had also really in our work taken into account the economic impact as in the way that you presented it as importantly as you presented it. I think that's really very important piece to the puzzle. Thank you.
I think Trisha has a question.
Thanks, Laura. Yeah, I what's interesting about this conversation that kept coming up about this being a structural issue, but it seems like research, and I'm thinking of this from psychological research, just because that's my area of training. But like psychological research tends to really be focused on the individual person. And so my question for the panelists were just, do you see research as studying this in a structural way? And how can research change to really look at this through a structural lens, maybe after a policy change has happened, looking at how that impacts people's psychology, as opposed to just looking at the psychology and the individual, trying to bring in some of these structural things. So yeah, are people aware of research looking at it this way? And I think sometimes researchers might not really know how. So do people have thoughts of how the research can change to look at it in a more structural way?
Absolutely. I mean, I think you definitely highlight a really important part about research, and something that my colleagues and I have been talking about and struggling with is like, what is research, and are we asking the right question? And research itself is also a structural domain and target thing too, in terms of who's the one who is offering the money and the grants to be able to do the research, because it is monetary value too. And the type of grants that are being written are catered towards asking those questions that the grant writers want you to answer, but it may not get to the real problem. So it's already kind of delineated from you what you should be asking and how you should do it. And it really comes from, again, the historical perspective of what type of psychological research is important. And that has to do with randomized controlled trials, which tends to be along the most individualized treatment and a specific intervention. And I think there's been some percolating ideas that have been surfacing, mostly from the ground, that people are like, let's really try and think about it from a different perspective. And so there is a new frontier, like implementation science, which looks at really kind of understanding the, not the efficacy, but the effectiveness. And what I mean with that, like what really happens in the real world. And on top of that, you can really, when you think about what happens in the real world, you can think about it more from a structural perspective, like what type of training you're giving to the staff on the ground. Are they like listening to it? What type of environments that need to be promoted to be able to codify some of the integration of that? It's a burgeoning field, so there's not much money into that too. So when you think about, again, economic change, there needs to come down from the economics in terms of where your money is going and who's going to foot the bill. But some of that's coming along those lines. And I think, what the other thing we need to think about is who is doing the research. Oftentimes it is white men who are doing the research. And so they have their own particular types of questions and their own particular types of ideology. And so we really need to expand the field of who's doing the research and what that means, to give them people more power and more voice to try to ask different types of questions. In terms of social support, or even what Natalie had talked about, thinking about art therapy. People don't think about that, but that's important for us to consider, because that's what the clients and our survivors are telling us about. Also thinking about the impact of racism and discrimination, that has really not been in the forefront of research. On top of that, inviting people who've had histories of intimate partner violence, oftentimes they're excluded from research trials because they don't know what to do with that. But that doesn't mean we should ignore what their concerns are. And then on top of that, there's always this less of a focus on qualitative studies, which I think is really important when you think about how do you figure out what questions you need to ask. And then on top of that, it's really just trying to figure out what do you do with the answers and how do you get that and disseminate it out. Oftentimes research is really kind of circulated within academic journals that can be obscure, but then how do you translate that information to the community and to policy advocates to actually really take change and make sure that's a really effective way of moving forward. So that was a long spiel, but all I'll say is like, we can be doing so much better. And there's so much more further along we need to go to really kind of help capture that moving forward. And it does have implications in terms of policy changes, because if you do identify a particular movement within research, however it is, people are much more likely to take notice and think of it as scientific.
Yeah, I would just second everything there, but one of the things that we did last year in response to COVID was get cash grants to survivors. And we really just set this up to get cash to survivors, and figured while we were doing that, we'd ask a couple questions. None of the questions were required in order to get cash, and we made that very clear. But actually most people responded. And so we ended up gathering data from several thousand survivors in the US. And it was a real learning moment for us to, this is how you could do research in a way that actually is not extracting and really creates choice for folks to be able to share parts of their story, all of their story, depending on what they want to do. And, to answer the question about how can we use this to do structural research, we did a cash round specifically for Black, Indigenous, Latinx, queer, and/or trans survivors in December. And we had 2,500 survivors apply in 12 hours. And almost all of the survivors filled out the questions that we had. And one of the questions that we asked is which other forms of systemic violence have you experienced? And we listed about 20 different forms of systemic violence. Everything from police brutality to sexual harassment to ICE harassment, deportation threats, et cetera, et cetera. And we're still analyzing the data, but the first kind of response I got from my team was survivors of color have experienced on average 5 to 7 forms of systemic violence. And so I think there are ways, even outside of the context of kind of formal research and academia, to start to reframe the questions in order to get the answers that we need to see this structurally.
Thank you. I really appreciate you guys' responses.
So the next question is from one of the attendees. It's, how do you work with offenders?
I can jump in. It's tricky. It's tricky. Most people who work with victims or survivors, and I speak for myself, it's very tough working at the same time with perpetrators or the people who do the harm. Having said that, if one is working in families, one, and that's what that diagram that I shared is all about. They're two faces of the same coin. So it's not to say many times, it's who actually comes to therapy, who is in the room that you can work with. From a therapy perspective, who is it that's outside of the room that you're actually holding in mind while you're doing the therapy? Are those others coming just because they're mandated by courts to do that? And then is it effective? Does it help? So for me, it's to hold the entire system in mind when one is intervening. with who is there and then who is not there. But all the while recognizing that this idea of offending is complex, it's tricky, and the identities of sort of victim or perpetrator often go with the same person. And it's not to say that perpetration is okay, but it's to have a little bit more of a nuanced view on what the dynamic is all about and how to shift those sort of perpetrating or victimizing behaviors, and why to do that. So I think I would be happy to hear from others. It's always a tricky one. It's very hard to empathize with people who are harming others that you are attuned to. But to everybody's point, if we're not working within the system, the entire system, we're probably not affecting as much change as we could be. It doesn't mean that one person has to deal with all of that. Sometimes this is helpful when one splits and sort of divide and conquer, and there's a group working, with one group and others working with others. But one has to hold everything in mind when one is actually working. You're not just working with who's in front of you, you're working with generations that aren't in the room.
Yeah, no, absolutely. To piggyback up what Natalie said, I think, especially in the U.S., the way the system is set up, it is very much delineated in a black and white fashion that they're the victims, survivors, and then they're the perpetrators and people who do harm. There tends to be more resources allocated to the victim survivors and less to the perpetrators who do harm. And for the perpetrators who do harm, it's really kind of confined within the legal ramifications where police get involved, the legal system gets involved, and it's very much of a, we must like slap you on the wrist and keep you away, as opposed to more of a rehabilitation. But part of the problem is we don't have the resources to be able to understand the dynamics that Natalie has pointed out, and to also do the research behind what are those interventions that could be potentially helpful for rehabilitation. The only thing that they're very minimal interventions right now. The one that people talk about the most is the batterers intervention program, but that doesn't really have a very high success rate. On top of it, there's not much money allocated to do that type of work on top of that. Within our program, the Family Justice Centers, in terms of just doing the treatment, we only are allocated to work with the survivors and the victims. And part of the reason is that the FJCs are housed within next to a district attorney's office, and there's always police around. Once you enter, you are automatically, your background is looked up. And so if you have any pending charges, you're not allowed to enter. And part of it has to do with safety. But because they're not allowed to enter, they're not allowed to have access to any of those services. And so it becomes tricky. I agree, it really becomes a systemic issue. And if we need to reframe how we think about violence as more of a family violence, as more of a societal violence, as more as like, so not just only being hidden away, but think about how society plays into it too, to really kind of think about changing the systems of how services are allocated.
Thank you. Will anyone else want to tackle that question, or should we move on to the next one? Because we're running out of time too. Okay. So my closing question would be, most of our audience, because our network of species is mostly made up of psychologists. So my closing question to all of you would be, what do organizations such as Passi and other psychological organizations can do to support organizations or your work as panelists and in the UN and as FreeFrom and Salud? Anyone?
I'll jump in. I guess it's a bit hard to answer. The panelists, I think it's a hard one to answer. But I think for me, as a psychologist, I think it's to take our understanding and our expertise outside of sort of clinical environments and into communities a little bit more. Psychology is a very protective field in sub-Saharan Africa. There's so few psychologists around, actually. And how does one take mental health expertise to the great vast majority of those who need it in public health systems and at community level? How do we share our resources with people that are available to be able to get upskilled, to be able to also affect change? So I guess that's one recommendation that I have.
Sonia.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to see if someone else wanted to go, because I've talked a lot. You know, I think that there's a lot of opportunity to talk about the intersections of disability, mental health, and gender-based violence. Another one of the questions, because we wanted to talk about we wanted to be able to look at the intersection between intimate partner violence and disability. One of the questions that we asked survivors in our latest research was, which of the following forms of disability or differing ability do you have you experienced? And then we asked, do you attribute this to the harm that you experienced, or is it sort of unlinked? And more than half of survivors attributed it to the harm that they had experienced. And looking at the slide that Dr. Berry had about the different mental health diagnoses that can come from experiencing the acute trauma of violence, not just PTSD, I think there's a real space, at least here in the US, to go deeper into that and to hear directly from survivors what the mental health impact and what the disability impact of intimate partner violence is. So that's something that I would love to partner with other I'm not a psychologist, partner with psychologists on.
Thank you. And
Yes. I'm sorry, Laura.
No, go ahead, Lourdes.
No, I just wanted to add to what Natalie and Sonya were saying. Yes, moving forward towards community, right? Moving forward, learning outside the academic circles and the spaces that are typically what give you the authority to be a mental health practitioner. I think we need to listen more what is happening on the ground, how the women and people are assessing their mental health and how they want to engage in other ways of living, but not from a point of view of persisting judgment from any provider or any people that is available to them in a moment of crisis or in need. I think at least for us here in Puerto Rico, there's still a lot of taboos and myths surrounding mental health awareness. And I think more practitioners are needed to have a tool set, a more emancipatory work tool set on hand to work with them. I think, yes, in that line.
You know, I think what you're doing right now by convening this talk with the panelists is also a great step. You know, I'm a firm believer that knowledge is power. And one of the things that, you know, organizations can do is provide that knowledge to people who may not have access to it. There was an old statistic I saw that 1/3 of the clinical psychologist programs, and then even less within medical schools, actually teach about intimate partner violence and family violence. And so if you're not teaching about it and you're setting these trainees off to become future doctors, you know, and they encounter people in their office, and again, 1 in 3 women, 1 in 4 men who have experienced this, they are doing a disservice. And so there really needs to be an awareness campaign to bring this more to the attention. And on top of that, it's not even just awareness, but knowing what to do with the information, because you need to know, there needs to be some type of behavior change and some type of authority to be able to make impact on an individual level with the client, which is so powerful, but also on a systemic level too, to be an advocate for your clients in your class.
Thank you, Dr. Berry. So we are out of time, and I want to thank you all for being here. Thank you all for such a great and compelling conversation and discussion. And I hope this was a space for everyone where they could learn about different perspectives in how to address and how to eliminate the intergenerational transmission of trauma, of gender-based violence, sorry. If there are any follow-up questions, I put my email in the chat box, and also you can connect directly with our panelists. And I'm looking forward to keep in contact with all of you, and thank you for being here.